Okay, wonderful. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Hillary, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the New York Transit Museum. Today's program is MTA Climate Action, and we're going to learn about the incredible array of projects that the MTA is engaged in to keep our transit system resilient and sustainable in the face of climate change. The Transit Museum is located in downtown Brooklyn in a decommissioned IND subway station. It's a really unique space dedicated to New York's incredible transit history. We're open from Thursday to Sunday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., and you can reserve tickets on our website. We also have a gallery and shop in Grand Central Terminal with a new exhibit that just opened featuring new acquisitions to the museum's collection. Now for today's program, if you'd like captions, click on the captions button at the bottom of your screen and select to show captions. If you don't see that setting, you can click the three dots at the bottom and you should see it in an expanded menu of options. Please feel free to use the chat to post questions and comments, and we will have time to respond to those questions at the end of the presentation. I will share them with our presenter. So now I'm pleased to introduce our presenter today. We have Eric Wilson with us. For the past 2 years, Eric Wilson has served as Vice President of Climate Resilience and Sustainability Planning at MTA's Construction and Development Agency. Eric and his team integrate proactive climate actions into the MTA's entire capital program, including strategies to reduce climate risk exposure and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. On a daily basis, Eric engages with each of the MTA's operating agencies to advance climate programs. Eric joins the MTA from the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, where he focused on building climate adaptation policies for land use and buildings. Eric lives in Brooklyn and he commutes to work either by subway or city bike, depending on the weather, both very environmentally friendly options. So thanks so much for joining us today, Eric, and now I'll hand it over to you.
Hey, Hillary, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for joining this conversation about climate actions at the MTA. I'm really excited to share what we've been up to. Hopefully my screen is gonna work. So I don't think it's news to anybody that climate change is really impacting the MTA. There's a lot of pictures that circulate on social media after an extreme weather event. On the left, we have a bus flooding incident in Staten Island. In the center, subway flooding up in Upper Manhattan and Inwood off of Dyckman Street. And then a landslide along the Hudson line that occurred up in Westchester County in 2021. These impacts are really affecting our systems. And at the same time, transit is a really important ingredient in our fight against climate change. Transit emits a fraction of the greenhouse gas emissions of other transportation modes. So it's really important that we figure out ways to keep transit, expand it, and make it more resilient in the face of climate change impacts. And so today I want to cover both of these sides of the climate action coin and share with you some strategies that we're undertaking in the MTA on both of these pathways. But I want to clarify when I use this term climate sustainability, what I'm talking about is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. These are the greenhouse gas emissions that are contributing to global warming, creating the melting of the ice caps and glaciers that are causing sea level rise and changing weather patterns that lead us to needing to do climate resilience to protect the system against climate risks. So I'll use both of these terms, but I want to make sure that everybody understands what I'm referring to. Sustainability about greenhouse gas emissions, resilience is reducing risk exposure. What's exciting about my role at the MTA is that climate actions are now embedded in our capital plan, which means the way that the MTA plans for the future in terms of construction projects, infrastructure upgrades, infrastructure investments, all take into account both climate resilience and climate sustainability. And you can see that climate actions are featured in our 20-year needs assessment that came out in last October. You can visit future.mta.info to find out about our 20-year needs. This is a document that contains a projection of our our capital needs, both to repair the existing system to keep it going, also proposals for system expansions, and climate actions are front and center of all of these things. All of these issues are now being taken into account as we prepare for the 5-year capital plan, which will be coming out in October of this year. So I want to start off sharing with you our climate sustainability framework. We released this sustainability framework back in Earth Day last year. So it's our first year now in implementing the sustainability framework. And this is the first time that we actually set a greenhouse gas emissions reduction goal for MTA operations. And so it's a really exciting way to think about how we advance our capital planning in a way that achieves these greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. And it's really important that we think about the role of transit in greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So, just stepping back a little bit and zooming out, and recognizing that transportation is the country's most significant greenhouse gas emissions source, more so than any other of these other sectors. And this is data that comes from the US EPA. And as we start to break down different transportation modes, we can see how transit really emits a fraction of the greenhouse gases of other transportation modes, particularly ride-hail services like Uber and Lyft that using gasoline vehicles. And we break it down on a per passenger mile amount of carbon emissions. We really see, even when you're looking at diesel buses, but certainly regional rail and subways, a fraction of the greenhouse gas emissions per passenger mile compared to single occupancy vehicles. Transit also reduces car dependence. And we found a statistic that if New York City residents owned as many cars as the average American, there would be 4.5 million more cars in the city, actually requiring a parking area the same size as Manhattan, if you're looking at 150 square feet per parking space, which is the typical size of a parking space. So it's just kind of mind-boggling to look at some of the benefits of transit. And we undertook an effort to quantify some of these, looking at the different impacts of transit. So we took into account the benefits of transit by shifting people from vehicles to using cars and whether the greenhouse gas benefits of that. We looked at the fact that transit doesn't require fuel, so we're gaining an emissions benefit called the upstream effect, where we are discounting the production and transportation of fuel to the city that would otherwise be consumed by single occupancy vehicles. The network effect, which is looking at the efficiency of the roadway system when the transit system is fully operational. And then the land use effect, which looks at the dense land uses that are allowed and the sustainable transportation modes that are unlocked when transit systems are running efficiently. And we took a look at each of these to quantify the aggregate value of transit in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And we estimate that MTA transit avoids more than 20 million metric tons of carbon emissions every year. And this is really mind-blowing. It's about the amount of carbon absorbed by a forest equivalent to the size of Indiana. About the same emissions from 51 billion miles driven by a typical car. So I just want to start off this conversation about sustainability, recognizing that the choices that transit riders make in choosing a transportation option are really critical to the climate fight. And that's why it's so important to keep investing in transit and even to keep expanding it. Um, and as we look nationally, once again, we see that New York City residents and even New York State residents have a much lower per capita greenhouse gas emissions rate compared to the typical resident nationally, primarily because of the high concentration of transit use in the New York City region. So recognizing that MTA is already part of the climate solution, there's many ways that we can make our systems even more sustainable. And I want to recognize that it's a balancing act that we need to undertake as we think about ways that we invest and change the status quo to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from MTA operations. We want to make sure that our transit remains affordable, safe, and reliable. And so as we're threading the needle in towards lower greenhouse gas emissions from MTA operations, we want to ensure that we maintain those levels of affordability and reliability, even as we're changing the way that we do business going forward to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this actually is a key component of our climate sustainability framework, to continue to grow ridership, attract new riders, bring more people to transit, because this is the best thing that we could be doing to continue to achieve regional and statewide greenhouse gas emissions. But that said, we did set a target by 2040 to reduce our own operational emissions 85% from a 2015 baseline. So back in 2015, we counted our emissions at just over 20 million metric tons. This is from MTA operations, and bringing these down to just over 300,000 metric tons by 2040. So a significant reduction in our own emissions. And we see three strategies to achieve this emissions reductions target. We'll be looking at our facilities, the numerous buildings that we own and manage and keep our transit system running, where we service our vehicles and have offices like this one. Transition our fleets, so establish decarbonization pathways for our various vehicles. And then third, use energy efficiently in the systems that we use. And so I want to share some examples of initiatives that are underway in each of these categories. So starting off with updating facilities, there's three pictures here. On the left, there's a picture from Brewster Yard up in the northern regions of Metro North Territory. There's a couple of workers below a radiant heater. And what Metro North is installed these heaters inside a building that used to have a ventilation system that blew hot air around. The hot air would escape the building every time garage doors open to let trains in and out. And it was a really inefficient heating system. And we found that there's significant energy efficiency benefits and therefore sustainability benefits by introducing these heaters that keep workers warm, exactly where they need to be, getting the heat where it needs to be, instead of having less efficient HVAC systems that just sort of blow hot air around the entire building without sort of a focus. In the center is a picture of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. Bridges and Tunnels has installed LED lighting across all of their infrastructure, all bridges and all tunnels. This is having a huge energy savings benefit for bridges and tunnels and does translate into greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And it was just announced by Subways that they'll also be transitioning subway platform lighting to LEDs throughout the system as well. On the right is a photo of Harmon Yard, also in the northern regions of Metro North Territory, where they've just installed and activated a solar PV, solar photovoltaics array on top of Harmon Yard. So this is the first for Metro North. This is going to be generating electricity that will be used at this facility. And part of this is to reduce the amount of operational energy that it's drawing from the grid, and also to serve as an element of redundancy if the grid, does for some reason, if there's a brownout or a blackout, there will be able to have existing systems able to run because of the power generated from this PV array. So a variety of the strategies that we're undertaking to update facilities to make them more sustainable. With fleets, I want to talk about a few things. On the left, a picture of a little white and blue, what we call a non-revenue vehicle. Non-revenue is a term where passengers aren't riding on these. These are really service vehicles. There's many of these. And we have a goal to transition all of our light duty, all of our small non-revenue vehicles to EVs, electric vehicles, by 2030. And we have a parallel goal for our medium and heavy duty vehicles to transition all of them to decarbonize by 2040. So that's an example in the center with a bus. This is really the star of the show when it comes to fleet transitions. Our zero emissions bus transition program is looking to decarbonize our entire bus network by 2040. This is actively in progress. We're looking at electric buses. We're also looking at hydrogen technologies for propulsion for buses. And this is also going to require investments in all of our bus depots, which were originally constructed for diesel fueling, and now are going to have to be retrofitted to facilitate other types of propulsion systems for buses. On the right is an example of a work locomotive. These are, if you've ever been in the subway system during evening hours and late night hours, sometimes you've probably encountered some of these work trains. The work trains need to have independent propulsion with the locomotive because we power down the third rail, and so they're not able to work on electrified power. So right now they're diesel. And we're looking at alternatives to make these either hybrid or decarbonized. And so that's actually a very exciting initiative on the subway system to transition fleets. The third category, optimize traction power, use energy efficiently, really speaks to the fact that we are a large power user. Much of our systems are already electrified. The entire subway system, of course, is electrified, and many of the regional railroad networks are electrified. And so, most of our electricity use, the pie chart on the left, shows that the majority is really about traction power for trains. Only less than a quarter of our electricity use is for stationary uses, things consumed in buildings and bridges and tunnels. And so we're looking at ways to more efficiently use this traction power in a way that conserves energy, reduces our energy utilization during peak demand periods. So we're looking at technologies. This in the center represents this idea of a smart battery, where we are making better use of the kinetic energy generated from the braking action of trains, identifying ways to capture that energy in a battery during peak demand periods of electricity demand, storing it in the battery, and then releasing it again during peak demand periods, so that we're drawing less from the grid when energy is most in demand from consumers across the city. So it's an experimental technology that we're looking at now, but just an example of trying to use our traction power more efficiently. On the right is one of my favorite projects. This is an example in the wintertime. Subways has an electric coil along the third rail to keep it from freezing. And traditionally, there would be workers that would go out and switch on the third rail heater at the beginning of winter and then leave it on and then turn it off again at the end of winter. And what this system is that's pictured here is a remote control system so that workers can remotely activate the third rail heater system during periods of cold snaps, and then turn it off again when it's not needed. And so it doesn't need to be on during the whole winter. And this saves us a ton of energy. And it's just a simple way to, there's a lot to install, but really at the end of the day, it's a very simple way for us to reduce the amount of energy that we consume from third rail traction power, and just a way to be much more efficient and sustainable in our operations. So looking beyond our operational emissions, I also want to talk a little bit about our clean construction program. And this is a program that we launched in October of last year. We announced that for the first time, the MTA is going to start tracking embodied carbon associated with construction projects. Embodied carbon is the carbon emissions associated with construction materials. We're going to be tracking steel, asphalt, glass, and concrete. And of course, we have a significant capital plan. We build a lot of stuff. And so we hope to make a major milestone in reducing construction related emissions, not only through construction materials, which, we're in this year-long pilot to track our embodied carbon as a result of consuming these materials in construction. We're also looking at alternatives for construction equipment to see if we can use ways to find low or no emissions construction equipment across various sites. We're looking at our construction waste and reducing the amount of construction waste that is landfilled and trying to divert as much as possible. And we're looking at new design standards because we recognize that the stuff that we're building now is going to have longevity, and that during design and construction is really the time to select materials, to select systems that have a lower carbon impact. And so we're working more within our teams within construction and development here at MTA to achieve all of these goals related to our construction program. So just some example of numbers, in 2022, we used over 45,000 tons of concrete across our system. This has a pretty significant greenhouse gas emissions impact. So, as we're setting some of these baselines, we are looking to ramping these things down over time as we continue to build more and more transit. And just, a little bit about our construction waste. We do work with all of our contractors to track construction waste, and we are pretty proud of our diversion rate right now. We're diverting a significant amount of our construction waste from landfills, and we're always looking at ways to increase this even more. Okay, I want to transition towards the other side of the climate action coin and share with you a little bit about our climate resilience strategies. So I delivered this presentation to the MTA board in January of this year, and I'm excited to go through this with you all now. And we are looking to release a document in the spring, in the next few weeks, with more detail behind these strategies that I'm going to be covering. So this is, just really a preview. Um, so let me go ahead and get into our climate resilience roadmap. And again, switching from greenhouse gas emissions reductions program to how we reduce the impacts of climate change on MTA infrastructure as a whole. I want to start off with some good news. We have been very busy installing climate resilience mitigations across the system, particularly since Superstorm Sandy hit the New York Metro back in October of 2012. There are literally thousands of mitigations that have been installed across the system during that time. This is a $7.6 billion partnership that we've had with the federal government. The system is undoubtedly more resilient than it was when Sandy hit, particularly to coastal storm surge. But this was really a learning moment for us, and we're continuing to iterate on these mitigations. And so the climate resilience roadmap that we're about to release is really climate resilience 2.0 for the MTA as we continue to look forward, building on this work that's been advanced since Sandy. Um, so we want to recognize that, while we have done all this Sandy work, and the need for a climate resilience roadmap 2.0 is that climate change is continuing. And we're tracking these four different categories of climate risk, among others: coastal surge, sea level rise, torrential rain, and extreme heat. Coastal surge is the phenomenon when a tropical storm with significant wind speeds pushes ocean water onto land. this is a boat that ended up on a subway track in the Rockaways because of the strength of that level of coastal surge. This is the phenomenon that occurred during Sandy. Sea level rise, of course, is a longer term phenomenon caused by the melting of polar ice caps and glaciers that's increasing the levels of the oceans. As a coastal city and a coastal region, we're quite vulnerable to sea level rise, and we have quite a bit of coastal infrastructure that we need to keep our eye on as sea level rise occurs throughout the region. Torrential rain is something that I think all of us are becoming more and more accustomed to, particularly with the events that occurred last year. Torrential rain is intense rainfall over a short period that starts to impact things that are underground, like the subway system and basements and buildings, where water that is surpassing the capacity of the system to be able to handle finds other ways to go. Um, and then extreme heat, of course, impacts our system, infrastructure, customers, and workforce as well. And so between now and the 2050s, we expect coastal surge, coastal floods to become 3 times more likely than they are now. Sea level rise to increase by up to 30 inches across the region. Torrential rain number events to double between now and the 2050s, and approximately triple of the number of high heat days above 90 degrees between now and the 2050s. And we're grateful to the New York City Panel on Climate Change, which provides us with all these data upon which we benchmark our own infrastructure too. So this climate resilience roadmap that we're going to be releasing consists of an assessment of our current and future climate vulnerabilities, like those that I just went over, and maps those to our infrastructure. This includes subways, buses, bridges, and tunnels within the boundaries of New York City, but also Long Island Railroad and Metro North infrastructure extending out into the region. Um, the roadmap articulates 10 climate resilience goals that address the vulnerabilities and infrastructure assets in different categories, as well as an implementation framework that I'll talk a little bit about. So the vulnerability assessment consists of a few different components. I mentioned that we take into account climate hazard projections. We're looking at sea level rise, torrential rains, coastal surge, in heat, among a couple of other things, wind speeds and winter weather as well, and projecting those into the 2050s, 2080s, comparing them to current year, mapping those against all of our assets, our various track and switches and maintenance facilities, culverts, and starting to understand where there's vulnerabilities to those climate risks over the long term. And then taking into account the completed protections that I mentioned, the variety of Sandy protections that have been installed. There's also been quite a few heat mitigation strategies that we've installed in the system, as well as torrential rain mitigations. And in a nutshell, that constitutes our climate vulnerability assessment that we're building on for the roadmap. So I want to share with you some of the findings with this. So um, looking at underground subway infrastructure, we have about 200 subway stations that have been impacted in one or more recent torrential rainfall events. And of course, about 63% of our subway system is underground and therefore vulnerable to torrential rain, particularly at intensities greater than 1.75 inches an hour. And this is the capacity of the New York City storm sewer system, where it starts to fill up and there's fewer and fewer places for intense rainfall, stormwater runoff to go. And seeking the next lowest place, it often impacts our subway system. And this is a picture in the Upper West Side at 79th Street, where the torrential rainfall has caused a flood. It's starting to impact the third rail, and we need to, cancel service at that time when subway flooding occurs to this magnitude. Subway yards are also an area that we're keeping an eye on. Subway yards are often located in coastal areas. Many of them were constructed in the 1920s when unfilled wetlands, and so have a combination of flooding risks, including coastal surge risks, torrential rainfall risks, and both of these are exacerbated by sea level rise when there may be exposure to tidal flooding that might coincide with a rainfall or surge event. Um, all these little dots on the left show locations where we've installed Sandy mitigations. So, many places in Coney Island, in the Rockaways, in Upper Manhattan, in the North Shore of Staten Island, at Clifton Yard, all have surge mitigations that are able to be deployed. But there are other yards where we have detected levels of vulnerability, and that we will be looking at for the capital plan going forward. Bus depots are also vulnerable to combined flooding risks. There's many bus depots located in coastal areas that have some level of unmitigated surge risk, and there's bus depots located in inland areas that have a level of torrential rainfall flooding risk, just like the subway system. This is a picture from Jackie Gleason Depot, which is in Sunset Park in Brooklyn, an inland area, but is vulnerable to runoff from particularly intense rainfall events. Heat, I mentioned, is something we're looking at, and the way that vulnerability works in heat, extreme heat situations, is different in underground and outdoor locations. In underground locations, I think all of us have had the experience of waiting for a subway train in a sweltering subway station, so we know that feeling viscerally. And in addition to customers and workforce impacts of extreme heat in underground locations, we're also keeping an eye on impacts to equipment. This is a picture at Wall Street Station, where we need to be mindful of communications equipment that's particularly sensitive to high heat, high humidity situations, and make sure that equipment is cooled to a level where it can remain operational. This is not only communications equipment for inside the station, but it's communications equipment for the system as a whole. So we need to make sure that that remains operational during high heat periods. And in outdoor locations, particularly during prolonged heat events over 90 degrees, metal components expand. And so hopefully you can see in the right-hand side, there's a rail that has sort of a misalignment in it. This is called rail kinking that occurs when metallic components expand during high heat events. And this causes service cancellations. There was actually a derailment event on Metro North on the New Haven line during this particular event in 2017. But we need to be aware of how high heat events impact our outdoor infrastructure. It's not just track, it's also signals, bridge expansion joints, anything that has a metallic component that's subject to expansion during high heat events. So continuing on the theme of regional railroad impacts to climate change, um, there's quite a impact of torrential rain along our regional railroads, and we've started to map out all these red lines on the map on the left indicate places where there have been recent impacts on the regional railroads due to torrential rain. This is from our chief logs account, where train operators note that there's an impact on track that may lead to service impacts. We mapped steep slopes adjacent to regional railroads and found that 41% of Metro North track and 19% of Long Island Railroad track is adjacent to steep slopes. And this is important because the steep slope adjacency causes stormwater runoff to increase in velocity, which can impact train ballast. You can see in this picture of the Hudson Line in particular, a washout occurring, but also in Long Island Railroad as well, where stormwater really creates service impacts that we need to keep an eye out for. And then I mentioned we're also looking at sea level rise along our regional railroads. Through the 2080s, sea level rise does impact several locations along the regional railroads, 64 miles of regional railroad track by the 2050s, increasing up to 175 miles by the 2080s. We took a stab at a couple of renderings to illustrate what this might look like as sea level rise occurs. And so using New York City panel on climate change projections and by the 2030s. So this is at Spuyten Duyvil Station on the Hudson Line. This is at the intersection of the Harlem and Hudson rivers, just in the Bronx. And with 12 inches of sea level rise by the 2030s, we start to see a little bit of encroachment into the right of way at Spuyten Duyvil Station by the 2030s. But it really starts to become more acute by the 2050s, where we're projected to have up to 30 inches of sea level rise. We can see during tidal flooding events, and again, tidal flooding events are caused by their lunar high tide, so it's the gravitational pull of the moon, that occurs on a monthly basis. This would be the highest of the high tides. It's starting to encroach upon the third rail, where we need to, really start thinking about service impacts. It has obvious consequences for capital planning and operational planning that we're starting to take into account. So I mentioned that the climate resilience roadmap incorporates 10 goals to boost climate resilience. These address all of these asset types that I've gone through in a nutshell here. There's going to be a lot more detail in the document, but we want to address every component of our system and really be thinking about climate resilience in a holistic way as we advance capital planning going forward. I mentioned that the climate resilience framework or climate resilience roadmap includes, 4 components towards implementation. Talked a little bit about our capital plan. There's always going to be a resilience component to our capital plan going forward. But I want to talk about how we design as well. So, taking into account the numerous projects that we undertake as a matter of course, we're constantly improving elements of the system. And the intent going forward is, as we undertake those projects, how can we incorporate information about future climate risks so that the things that we're building and improving now anticipate the climate of the future? And so this is an example of an elevated signal case along the Long Beach branch, to protect these vulnerable systems from flooding that occurs along here. Operating actions are really important as well. So, we work with each of the operating agencies across the MTA to anticipate extreme weather and taking proactive steps to keep the trees out of the rights of way during periods of extreme wind, which can cause trees to topple that result in service impacts. How can we increase drain cleaning? To make sure that the drains are fully operational in the subway system during periods of torrential rain. So these are operating actions that we're going to continue to keep track of, especially just before extreme weather events. And then the fourth component of the implementation framework is working with other agencies. There's so many connections between our transit systems and adjacent infrastructure. We rely on our electrical utilities to provide us continuity of electricity during extreme weather events. We also rely on adjacent municipalities for storm sewer services. And these are our partners at the New York City Department of Environmental Protection that are investigating a sewer adjacent to a subway tunnel to make sure that the sewer system is operating at capacity. And we have regular discussions with them to make sure that their system is optimized before torrential rainfall events. Um, so just a little bit of an example of, a little bit more detail about one of the goals. So our first goal in the climate resilience roadmap is shield subway stations and tunnels from torrential rain. I mentioned about 200 subway stations have been impacted by one or more torrential rainfall events that we've been recording since 2007. We have a variety of actions. All the little circles in blue are steps that we've taken at the MTA. The circles in green are where we're working with other city agencies, particularly the Department of Environmental Protection, also the Department of Transportation, which maintains the city's streets and sidewalks, that has a role in preventing stormwater runoff into the subway system. But just to sort of illustrate the multi-pronged approach that we're taking to reduce the amount of subway stormwater flooding during torrential rainfall events. We're also particularly focused on Metro North infrastructure. There's been a lot of events recently, particularly along the Hudson line, which has just been very vulnerable, just adjacent to the Hudson River at the bottom of a steep slope. And there's been a lot of impacts, particularly during torrential rainfall events. On the left are a couple of pictures of a washout that occurred at Dobbs Ferry and a culvert repair that resulted from that. We're taking into account future climate risks, but really keeping an eye on where the vulnerabilities are at and prioritizing capital infrastructure investments based on those vulnerabilities going forward. On the right is a picture of Mott Haven Yard. This is in the South Bronx. And this is where all three east of Hudson lines converge before they split off to Hudson Line and then Harlem and New Haven lines. This area is in a particularly low location in the South Bronx and really subject to stormwater flooding. So you'll certainly see these themes emerge in the climate resilience roadmap as well as the upcoming 5-year capital plan. Just a little bit in terms of next steps on our climate resilience roadmap. I mentioned our 20-year needs. We'll be releasing the roadmap itself in the next few weeks in anticipation of the 5-year capital plan in the fall. Okay, so that's my formal dog and pony on climate actions. I know I've thrown a lot at you all, but I'm excited to uh, have a conversation and tackle some questions that you might have.
Okay, great. That was fantastic, and it's just really impressive to see this just wide array of projects that you're working on, and also just it seems like those challenges keep on coming. So I guess you have to be very resilient in your approach. There was some great questions in the chat, so I'm going to go through some of those. If you have any more, please feel free to add those in, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. So there was a lot of interesting questions early on about electricity and that whole system. So I'll try to take these a few piecemeal.
Yeah.
It seems like a lot of the strategies rely on some kind of outside utilities. Do you have any plans on generating that electricity in, like a carbon neutral or low carbon way, or is it still kind of relying on fossil fuels at the generation point?
Yeah. So okay, so there's a couple of questions in there. I would say that we are looking at ways of increasing our own capacity to generate electricity, particularly at our facilities. That example of the solar array at Harmon Yard, we're definitely looking to build on and evaluating other facilities across the system for solar or potentially other means of generating our own electricity. Um, and potentially storing some of that electricity on site as well. Um, we will continue to be reliant on the broader grid that serves New York City and the region as a whole. And so we are working, together with NYSERDA and other entities across the state as we transition the grid over the longer term to cleaner sources. But our indirect emissions, of course, are a result of the production of the region's electrical grid electricity. Um, so yeah, so we're multiple prongs again.
Right. I mean, a couple related questions in there was whether these solar installations can, feed those batteries for like the electric buses. Is that one of the plans? And another was about whether we could transition some of those locomotives to be battery powered. I know you said some of them are hybrid.
Yeah, yeah. So we are looking at battery storage of a variety of different kinds. So for facilities and for bus charging, we are looking at how solar could complement our zero emissions bus transition plan, whether or not it's providing electricity source for the facilities, as sort of a complementary electricity source for charging charging the buses. Those are active conversations that we're having now. We're also looking at on-site battery storage that could provide an element of electrical resilience just within our facilities. Um, so I would say all of these are part of the plan, and we hope to have more to share. It's a very exciting world where all of those technologies are evolving very quickly, along with the vehicle technologies, for our small vehicles, for our medium and heavy duty vehicles. There's so many technologies that are evolving very quickly. So we're keeping an eye on all of these kinds of things. On the locomotives, I would say that we're also looking at a variety of different technologies. We're excited to look at hydrogen powered um, locomotives, which I know are, common in other areas in Europe and in Asia. And so, we're looking at ways we could pilot some of those technologies here as well.
Is hydrogen power what you talk about when you talk about clean diesel? I was like, I wonder what clean diesel is.
Yeah, clean diesel is actually something else. So there are ways of manufacturing diesel from a variety of other sources. There's a clean diesel production that uses, biofuels that are, captured from, you know, cooking oils and, other kinds of waste organics um, that that could be used as a substitute for traditional diesel. So, I think particularly for difficult to decarbonize um, elements of our fleet, like locomotives or medium and heavy duty vehicles, we will be looking at alternatives to traditional diesel, like cleaner sources of diesel as, alternatives going forward. And I would say that we have precedent for this with our buses. So many of our buses right now are fueled by compressed natural gas, and we're actually using renewable natural gas and across our bus, our natural gas powered bus fleet, which is also powered through, cleaner sources than traditional natural gas.
That's fascinating. Um, to go back to the electricity question, there was a question about kind of reliability, and I was interested to think as we add in these new technologies and new kind of methodologies, are they as reliable as kind of our tried and true kind of fossil fuel reliance, or do you have to then deal with other issues like power outages and things like that?
Yeah, no, I would say that's the biggest tension that we have internally as we're looking to change from the status quo, or questions about reliability, because I mentioned that, our core mission is to provide transit services that, if more people used, we wouldn't be in such a climate mess that we're in, because these transit services are so important in the climate fight. And so we want to make sure that as we're changing, as we're adopting new technologies and trialing new ways of doing business, that we're not compromising the reliability of the system. And so, we're being very careful and deliberate in trying new technologies going forward. So, um, really trying to minimize the amount of volatility that new technologies might bring to the reliability and certainly the safety of our transit services.
Is that hard to kind of gauge, or is it just problems arise that you have to deal with them as they come?
I think it's about finding the right location and place and partners to pilot new technologies with, and to have a sort of a safe space where we're able to try out new things, you know, create the opportunity for innovation, and do so in a way that doesn't have an impact on the broader system. And so, you know, there's so many different trial projects that are going on now throughout the system, um, and you know, I think there are some that are more promising others than others that will start to have broader rollout across the system once we have a level of confidence in their ability to, maintain continuity, but also achieve the efficiencies and reliability that we're looking for.
Yeah, that's really interesting. How long is like a trial process generally, or is it different for different technologies?
Yeah, I think it really varies. There's some technologies that are, um, you know, so the smart battery pilot that I had mentioned is actually, very long term. That's a project that's been going on for a couple of years now, and we're just about to install part of the system part of the smart battery system at Nostrand Avenue. Um, and it will be a pilot for about a year. So that we understand how the smart battery system works, whether or not it's successful in capturing kinetic energy, and if we're able to, and that particular pilot is going to involve many partners, including Con Ed, our utility, because it is adjacent and connects into their infrastructure. Other pilots might be quicker. There's sensor technologies that are out there for extreme heat, or actually Metro North, a good example. Metro North has painted some of their rails white to reduce the amount of heat gain in some of their in some of their open rails. Um, and that pilot actually has proven to be successful, and we're looking to try it out even in portions of the subway system, portions of the exposed subway system. So yeah, it does vary quite a bit throughout the system based on the complexity of the pilot.
Yeah, and it seems like the trials themselves can be complex depending on how many people and groups and organizations are involved. It's a lot to manage. Um, there's a question here. Thoughts on your thoughts on the development of Queens Link and its potential impact on emissions.
Yeah, I don't have yeah, that would be a system expansion. Um, and yeah, I'm not familiar with the details of the Queens Link proposal. I know that was in our latest comparative evaluation as part of our 20-year needs. My role is to really sort of focus on our existing operations. Um, yeah.
That's no problem at all. There was a couple questions going back to the construction waste and kind of what happens to that waste. I don't know if you could speak briefly on that.
Yeah, so one example that I'm aware of is that, we have multiple construction sites throughout the region. And one thing that our partners in the delivery unit of construction and development do is they have a database where contractors that have an excess amount of material or waste material that could potentially be used on another site are able to identify other sites within the region that could potentially use that material. Um, and this kind of exchange of waste construction waste materials, where it could be beneficial on another site, is really the sort of first in the order of operations in mitigating the amount of construction waste. Um, that I think is one of my favorite examples that we have to reduce the amount of construction waste, but we're also looking at incentives for contractors to reduce the amount of waste that they generate. Make sure that as much of it is diverted from landfills as possible.
Yeah, it makes sense to kind of plan that from the beginning. Um, I had a question. I don't know if this was came up in the chat, but I know that you have a plan of reducing emissions by that 85%. I'm interested how you actually measure that. Is it all estimates? Do you have certain tools? Like, can you get very accurate about what's really changing?
Yeah, we do have tools. So we measure our energy utilization. We have a database called an energy management system, where we keep track of how much electricity we consume, how much fuel of various kinds that we consume. Um, and we understand the emissions impact of producing that electricity or fuel. And that's what we use to estimate our emissions. Um, we do publish our emissions. If you go to mta.info, you'll find a link to our reported emissions. We actually have our emissions reports audited and submitted to the Climate Registry, which is, a nonprofit organization that that keeps track of climate emissions of corporations and sort of large organizations like ours, really across the world, and we're continuing to report our emissions to the Climate Registry. We've just reported our 2019 emissions. There's a couple of year lag in Climate Registry reports, but you will find all of those on our website. And we want to continue to make our emissions reporting more and more transparent, especially since we're working towards this 85% emissions reduction goal.
How is progress going so far? Do you remember off the top of your head where we're at?
Yeah, yeah. So it's really a complicated story. So our direct emissions are, COVID definitely threw things for a loop because, during that time there was much lower ridership, and we're continuing to recover from, and gain, ridership before as it was before the pandemic. Um, our direct emissions are generally lower, and we are, continuing to see our own progress. But as I mentioned, we are dependent on the production of electricity in the broader grid. And there was the decommissioning of the Indian Point nuclear power plant north of the city recently, um, which has that was considered a carbon-free source of electricity, which not just us, but the entire region had been using. And now that power plant is offline, we have seen increases in our indirect emissions, just as the broader city has had. Um, so it's a little bit of a it's a complex, nuanced story about emissions reduction, but that I don't think will distract us in keeping our eye on the prize in terms of longer term emissions reduction.
Okay, well, great. So I realize we're kind of at time. I wonder if I could ask maybe just one more question to wrap up, if that's
Yeah,
okay.
sure.
There was a question earlier about kind of the forecast for funding. Like I'm not sure, I know this is part of the capital plan, and so, money comes from somewhere. And do you anticipate fare increases or fares having to increase to kind of support some of these projects and investments?
Yeah. Well, so I mentioned our goal is to keep transit affordable because the last thing we want to do is displace transit riders. Um, so, we are the reason why I wanted to share with everybody that implementation framework with the climate resilience roadmap is that resilience and sustainability are going to be part of everything that we do. So there will be some, you know, projects, individual projects that reduce the amount of risk exposure, that achieve greenhouse gas emissions, that we will be investing in. But to the extent possible, we're looking to synchronize with ongoing investments that are going to be happening anyway to mitigate the cost impacts, particularly to customers, so that we're, just using limited funding wisely. I would also say that there are new opportunities that are available to us from the federal government that we're really looking to maximize. And, those conversations are very active right now.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I mean, that's great to hear. And I think it means a lot of us as writers, how much work that you are doing in the system, how important this is. And just to see the kind of, again, everything that's been accomplished and everything that's still in the works, it's really inspiring. I think you got a lot of accolades in the chat here.
Oh, I really appreciate everybody's attention on this issue. Thank you, everybody, for participating.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining and sharing your expertise. And thank you all for joining us today and sharing some really great questions. I just want to give a couple of final reminders and updates and kind of wrap up. Again, please join us at the museum. We're open Thursday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. You can reserve tickets on our website. Come see us. If you enjoyed the program, please consider making a donation or becoming a member. It really helps us keep these kinds of programs going. Our next virtual program that is coming up is very related, actually. It's on April 4th at 6 p.m. We're having a panel of experts that are going to be speaking about congestion pricing. Let me just put a couple of the links in the chat here. And congestion pricing is going to have a real big impact on the environment, a lot of benefits. So if you want to learn a little bit more about this policy, please join us then. So again, that's April 4th at 6 p.m. And we're also bringing more in-person programs back to the museum. On April 18th at 6 p.m., we will be having Thomas Abdallah, the MTA Chief Environmental Engineer, is going to be talking about his work in the system and his book, Sustainable Mass Transit. So if you are interested in this talk, that's, again, very related.
That's great.
And a way to, celebrate Earth Day. So again, thank you all for joining us. Thanks so much for being here, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, everybody.